Hi everyone, it's Henry here, and in this video I'm going to take a look at something a little bit different to what we usually do. Games Workshop sent us a copy of the new Black Templars Castellan miniature, and I thought it might be a bit of fun to have a look at one way in which we could approach painting a Grimdark style of miniature. Obviously the miniature is heavily influenced by this amazing John Blanche artwork from the 3rd edition of Warhammer 40,000. And Blanchitsu and Grimdark are often quite synonymous, so let's use that as an influence with this model. Now let's paint. Over a black primer, I airbrushed the whole model with Vallejo Game Air Black, just to give me a black base that I could touch up later if I needed to. For the first highlight, I'm going to use AK Interactive Reddish Grey. We've done a ton of different black armour recipes over the last year and a half, so rather than rehash one we've already used, including the Black Templars one, just thought we'd use some different colours in this one. And the Reddish Grey that I'm using here airbrushes nicely, and it's just to show that really you can kind of do whatever you want with black armour for your highlight colours. Just have a play around with it, use these videos as inspiration, but don't get bogged down all the time with really super specific recipes, because most of the time it just doesn't matter. If you like what you see, just get somewhere close. I've diluted about 2 drops of thinner to paint, and I'm using a 0.4mm needle and nozzle airbrush. I've applied the highlights there a couple of times, so I went around the whole model. I've gone back round it again, and you can see they're fairly broad, but we're still making sure we're leaving plenty of just pure black on show. When you use lighter colours, I would always err on the side of thinning them too far, because sometimes you can get a little sort of speckly effect when you've got the lighter colours. These paints seem to airbrush nicely though, and they paint on nicely. So for the final highlight, I'm going to use another AK paint, this time Rock Grey. You can see roughly the consistency there as I've sprayed it. And this time I want my highlight to be smaller, so tighter. One of the challenges when we're painting black armour is often not to make it look like a grey armour or dark green armour or dark blue, whatever the colours are we've chosen to highlight it with. And a lot of that's going to be achieved by how much of the surface is black, how much is the mid-tone, how much is the highlight. So if you look here, I've completely messed up the helmet there. I've painted far too much of that helmet, a larger surface of the area of that helmet with the light grey, and it's just spoiled it. It's easy to go back in and just tweak the shadows, which we'll do in a minute, but if I did something like I've done on the helmet there, I'm just going to completely repaint it. For sub-assemblies on this model, I have left the head not glued in and the backpack just tacked on, so it's easy enough to ping them off and just repeat the process, so black, reddish grey, rock grey, and just get it right. I'm going to do a lot of things over this colour, so it doesn't need to be absolutely perfect, but it needs to look vaguely like black armour, not like whatever on earth's happened on that helmet there. So I've gone back in there and tweaked it a bit, and you can see that highlight's covering a much smaller area now. And again, just like I did with the mid-tone, I've worked my way slowly around the model a couple of times, just working on the highlights rather than trying to do it in one go. Now where we've got a bit too much of that reddish grey has bled into the sort of areas that we want nice and dark, we can go back in with our Game Air Black, and I've thinned this heavily, so probably 3 or 4 drops of thinner to paint. So a very light, thin glaze consistency. And now I'm just going to start working the shadows again, creating a little bit of a blend between that reddish grey and the black, and just reinforcing the black in the shadows. You don't need to airbrush by any means. You could dry brush this up using the same colours, or we've got a great couple of videos on painting black armour just with brush, and I'll make sure I link those up above or down in the description. But the way the model presents itself, the various limbs, obviously it's a Space Marine, so it's fairly familiar shapes for a lot of people. But the way it's put together it's nice. It encourages you to sort of have a bit of fun, I think, with the painting on it. It's all fairly obvious where your light and your shadow should be. And I haven't tried to go fancy with my light sourcing at all, just from above. But I think that's a nice starting point. Now, for the tabards, I'm going to use a brown colour to base them with, and I'm going to use model colour US Olive Drab. This is one of my go-tos when I'm painting a light sort of tan or bone colours. I just really like it, and I like how it mixes with the highlight colours that we add in. So for a base coat, I'm just using, as you can see, quite a thin coat of the olive drab. I don't mind if a little bit of the black shows through, that's fine. And I don't need to build it up to be a super solid coat by any means. I'm also going to base coat the shoulder pads and the chest plate with this because they're going to be a bone colour, and I'm going to use the same colour to base coat both the cloth and the bone. Now I've added in a little Vallejo model colour deck tan into the olive drab, and again I'm keeping it really nice and thin. One of the challenges when we're using thin paint like this is not having too much on a brush. You can see at the very bottom of his cloak there, actually I had too much on my brush, and where I've removed my brush from the model, it's pulled a little bit at the bottom. So if you have a little bit of tissue or a cloth or something just to touch the brush off on before you touch it to the model, that's going to help take a little bit of that out. And again, I wasn't trying to do anything too clever with my highlights here. I've just sort of left the darker colour in the recesses, and now I've added in a little bit more deck tan into the mix, and I'll just do exactly the same. There's a ton of different ways I think that you can approach painting things in a Grimdark style. I think Grimdark and Blanchitsu are two slightly different things. And I think for me, if you're just talking about a Grimdark style, there's a ton of different ways you can go around and paint that. For the bone, I'm going to do a similar process, but I'm going to add in Karak Stone rather than deck tan. You can see it gives us a completely different colour, which is really nice. Karak Stone's a funny one. I feel like it dries a lot closer to white than it goes on. So it almost looks sort of, I don't know what you call it, it's almost a bit of ochre in it, but then you can see here once it's dried it goes this lovely, I think anyway, a really nice sort of older bone colour. I wasn't too fussed with this model when I first saw it, but I thought it'd be quite fun to paint for a tutorial video because we've had a lot of people ask about it. And as I've painted it throughout this video, I've really enjoyed it as a little one-off. Now the last thing I'm doing to the bone here is adding an enamel wash. Now this is a panel liner by AK, and it's for winter and white camo, I think it's called. In this bit of video footage, I've actually used the wrong panel liner initially. I've used a brown one. I was a bit confused why it was coming out so brown and not green. So yeah, check your pots. Once it was dry, I just put a couple of coats of the green one over the top of it. And you can see already it's just given this horrible, dingy old bone. I left it for about 10 minutes, then I popped the hairdryer on it. So it's still sort of wet in the recesses, but it's not flooding the surfaces anymore. And all I've done is taken a Q-tip and I've dipped that in some mineral spirits, in this case Winsor Newton Sansador. And I'm just very gently moving across the most raised surfaces of those panels. And you can see it just removes a little bit of that enamel wash and leaves that highlight colour, sort of the brightest colour. So as close to that Karak Stone mix we had underneath it. This is one of my absolute favourite ways of painting bone when I'm painting my own miniatures. And actually this model's quite close to how I enjoy painting miniatures just for myself. So whilst we're leaving that to dry fully, I'm going to start base coating the gold elements. And for this I'm using Scale 75 Decayed Metal. You could use any dark gold that you've got. Games Workshop Warp Block Bronze would work well. And if you haven't got a dark gold, just add a little dark brown paint into a gold that you do have. So you're just creating yourself a nice deep sort of metallic brown. And then for a highlight over that, I'm going to use Games Workshop Retributor Gold. It's a nice warm gold. I think it's a really good metallic paint. And I hadn't used it for a while, so dug it out and just, yeah, I think it works really nice. I'm really excited how this model's coming together. I know it's only sort of painted for a demo. But as I said, I've gone from not being that fussed by it to really loving it. Now to age up the gold, just make it look a bit more grim and gnarly, I've taken some Dark Angels Green contrast paint and I've mixed that with Agrak's Earthshade. And then I've watered that down just with normal water out of my paint pot. And it's roughly a 1-to-1 mix of all three of those. And just washing that over the gold. It's just going to knock it back. With your Grimdark painting, I think there's a bit of a thing for just covering it in enamel wash, wiping it off and calling it done. I think there's a lot more fun that you can have with it. So we're going to cover more that sort of thing in this video. Just for a little bit of extra colour, I've used copper there rather than using red, which I know is very popular and it's in the artwork and all the rest of it. I didn't want to, but Screaming Bell is a nice sort of red copper colour, so I just thought it added a touch of colour on there. Now for all the silver parts of the model, I've chosen Vallejo Metal Colour Series Steel, and this is a sort of dirty silver colour. It's quite similar to Games Workshop Iron Warriors. I feel like it's just got a bit more of an interesting colour to it than a typical silver, like a lead belcher or something like that. And then for the, I think, is it called the beard? I can't remember. The sharp bit, the edge, the blade, whatever it's called, on the axe, I'm going to use brightest silver I've got, and this is Vallejo Model Air Steel. We're going to go back in and play around with our metals at the very end anyway, but it's worth putting a couple of little highlights in at this point. For me, as I was saying earlier, Grimdark I feel is very much about the atmosphere or the mood that you create with your paint job, and I think that can be done with lots of different techniques, lots of different products, lots of different styles almost, and it can still be Grimdark. But for me, one of the things I think that sells it is that quite a high contrast with your metals. It's a real dingy dark, shadows in the metals and then super bright highlights on them. I wanted a touch more colour on here, and I know that I said red is a bit more traditional on this, but I love Barak Noir Burgundy, paint by Games Workshop. So I decided to paint his chest straps in with that. It's close enough to red. And it's just a colour, like I say, I really enjoy. And then a super simple highlight on this, just like everything's had basically a base coat and a highlight. That's all we're doing. I just mixed in, I think it was the rock grey. It was either the rock grey or the deck tan. It really doesn't matter. An off-white that just lightened it up a bit. You see, we've been fairly neat with everything we've done so far, but quite simple. And that's because we're going to be using a lot of oil now. And that's going to really bring an awful lot of interest to the stuff. I'm working from dark to light. I've took black, a couple of browns here, bitume and shadow brown. Then we've got a lighter brown, this is dark rust, an orange, which is light rust, and then this colour's called dust. They're all by AK, and I've chosen them because they're quite fast drying, which is particularly useful when I'm filming videos. So for the tabard, for the cloth on the model, I've taken some of the dark brown colour, then I've taken some of the light brown colour, and then I'm going to take some of that dust, that sort of tan, deck tan coloured oil paint here. And we're just sort of splodging it all over, but I've put more of that light colour where I think the light would be, and more of the dark colour where I think the shadow should be. Then I take a wider, soft, flat brush, pop it in some more mineral spirits, again, Sansador, touch off most of it so that it's just sort of damp, as you can see there. Now we're just going to work that oil paint into the surface. Providing our acrylic paint is dry underneath, we don't need to be using any varnishes or anything like that. Nothing's going to interact with each other or remove paint or anything. So just keeping my brush strokes in the direction of the cloth. We mix that oil paint on the model and we just get a ton of interest into that cloth. So you can see that's it, just the acrylics, and then even when the oil's not dry on the back you can see that difference it makes. Now I'm taking the black and the darkest brown, so that was the bitume and the black, and I'm just going to start splodging this all over the black armour. All I'm doing is working with dipping my brush continuously into my mineral spirits, then dabbing a little bit of the oil on it, and then mixing it and thinning it out on the model itself, rather than making pre-made washes. One of the reasons I like to do this is you end up with slightly different concentrations of the colour across the model. I just think it's a bit more interesting. If this Grimdark, let's call it, style is something you guys would like to see more videos on, please let me know in the comments. It's a style I particularly enjoy, and I actually think, as I've said already, there's a ton of different ways you can go about it, ton of techniques, ton of materials that we can use. This one I really wanted to look at the sort of the key idea of a nice simple base coat and a highlight, and then predominantly using oil washes and oil to create colour and interest in the model. I think I've left in all the footage of me going around. Obviously I've sped it up, but I've left it all in really of what I've done with the oil, just to give you an idea. But realistically, I think this sort of paint job on this model would take you 2, maybe at most 3 hobby sessions to do. So it would be just a really nice chilled sort of week's hobby project. And I think you could certainly replicate it across an army, no problem at all. I think it'd be a really nice looking army. Now once everything's got a bit of oil on it, I tend to leave it to dry. So again, go and make a cup of tea, walk the dog, whatever. Let it sort of start to dry naturally. And then after that, I would get the hairdryer on it, full heat, moving it around constantly, and it'll start to dry. And then you can go in and add some more. So I'm going back in now, and I'm using my lighter brown colours. So I've taken the light rust and the dark rust, so a sort of light brown and an orange. And I'm just going to start dabbing that here and there to get a bit of that in as well. And if, like on the axe you see here, I feel like it's built up a bit too much, just got thinner on my brush, and just letting it wash out on the surface and just move that pigment around to where we want it. So rather than going in with a Q-tip and removing everything and doing that sort of reductive painting style, which is totally legit, this is just a different way you can go about it. It's a bit more gentle, a little bit more control. And now I'm just going in once more with that orange. This looks particularly nice, I think, on black armour, but I didn't want to overdo it. I was originally going to sort of go quite far with battle damage and stuff on this model and all the rest of it, but actually as I was carrying on painting it and sort of getting to this stage, I was starting to really like how it looked, and actually I didn't feel like it needed battle damage on it to convey the look I was going for. This might be the first marine I've ever done where I haven't put like chips and battle damage on it, but I actually think he looked really nice. Quite tempted to grab another one of these and take a bit more time. I mean, I always say that and I never do, but I really have enjoyed painting this model. It's always nice when that happens. So now the oil's dried more or less fully, and I'm going back in with my gold, just add a little bit of shine on some of it, and I'll do exactly the same with the silver in a second. Once the oil paint's dried, you can paint over the top of this no problem with your acrylics. And if you find those faster drying oil paints, and typically all they do is have less oil in them, Winsor Newton do a range called Griffin Alkyd, and obviously you've got the AK Abtalung 502, sorry, they're called. I believe they're by AK, but the range is called Abtalung. But they just dry a lot quicker, which is great for miniatures painting. I've applied a little bit of that Vallejo texture paint to the base. I'm going to base them exactly the same as I do the vast majority of our YouTube miniatures, and I will link that up in the corner, how we go about that, and I'll list the pigments that I use down in the description, but it's the same technique nearly every time. So there we go in with the steel, so the brightest silver. We just bring back a little bit of that contrast, which I think shows up really nicely. But yeah, I think if I spent maybe one more session on this guy and wasn't filming it, I think he looked pretty cool. And obviously for Grimdark, we need to stick him on a black background. I believe that's how it works. But to be fair, it does, I think, completely change the atmosphere, doesn't it? And that's what we're after with this sort of thing. So you can see here I've added the pigments on the base. I've tried to mimic the colours that we got from that 3rd edition box art. And this is right up my street. I think it suits the model. It was very simple to do, as you've watched. But for my eye, it's given me a very pleasing result. And as I say, I think with if you actually wanted to elevate it slightly, all I would suggest is being a touch neater than I have been. And then perhaps doing the odd extra detail that I haven't bothered doing in this video. So there's a nice little melted candle on his backpack you could have some fun with. Perhaps I'd put a little bit of scorching on the end of the flamer that's on his bolter. But other than that, I don't really think there's much I'd do. I suppose the odd hazard stripe on one of the pipes maybe. That's quite Blanchitsu, isn't it? Grimdark. But yeah, lots and lots of fun. So I hope you've enjoyed this slightly different video to what we often do. Let me know in the comments, and also let me know in the comments if there's some models like this that you'd like to see this style of paint job on, and we'll pick them up and have a play around with them. So if you have enjoyed it, hit that like button, subscribe if you aren't already, tell your mates, and I'll see you next time.